My name is Junann Greeley, and I'm an associate professor of languages and literature, as well as Catholic studies at Sacred Heart University in Fairfield, Connecticut. There's a topic I would like to discuss that has meant a great deal to me over the last year or so, and it has to do with the ways in which the terrible tragedy of the Holocaust, the Shoah, has been exploited or continues to be exploited by certain groups and certain politicians in the United States today. Now, for all of us, we know that the Holocaust, the Shoah, was in some ways probably the greatest horror that human beings have ever visited upon other human beings. And there's still a great deal of it that still needs to be discussed and reflected on. But more than anything else, we need to understand that the history of the Holocaust is something that requires very close reading and a very close study. What we do know about the Holocaust, what we do know about the Shoah, is that human beings, simply because of their religious affiliation, primarily Jewish, simply because of their lives as other abled, possibly people who had affiliations that were political, were not just criticized, we're not just sort of limited in what they can do, or not just sort of told that they didn't fit in society. They were systematically brutalized, tortured, eventually separated out from society and dehumanized, and then eventually put into living quarters that ended up being death chambers. Over the last year or so, it's become painful to hear several American politicians and other sort of talking heads use the term Holocaust in ways that have nothing at all to do with what that actual historical event is. The Holocaust, we have to remember, is not just a matter of deep concern, obviously, for the Jewish people. The Holocaust is an act that needs to be addressed by Christians. Because speaking as someone of the Christian faith, the Holocaust happened because Christians and most politicians did nothing. The Holocaust was well known by many people of what was happening by certainly 1942, 1941. And people stood by and did nothing. The Catholic Church stood by and did nothing. I say that as a Catholic. Christian churches stood by and did nothing. American government stood by and did nothing. So there's a great deal that still needs to be addressed. And when American politicians and others, especially those who claim to have a Christian background, speak of their current situation and speak of, the fact that because they have to wear a mask, or because they're asked to get a vaccination, or because they're being maybe criticized on Twitter that they feel as if they're experiencing the Holocaust, or that they're experiencing the kind of genocide that was enacted against the Jewish people primarily in the Holocaust. As someone who's both a student as well as a scholar of Holocaust studies and genocide studies, and also is just somebody who cares about the moral fabric of what our children are hearing, it pains me and it also disturbs me, and it's something that I think we really need to think very carefully about. Because, in fact, nothing that people are experiencing today in the United States, no matter how much we're criticized, how much we feel that we lack a kind of freedom, nothing compares to the horror and the terror of what was the Holocaust. If somebody is asking someone to wear a mask, it's not like wearing a yellow star. It has nothing to do with wearing a yellow star. You can take your mask off at any time. You can wear it in different ways. You can wear different styles. And the fact that people are beginning to sort of exploit the language about the Holocaust and sort of apply it to their own discomfort with whatever kinds of medical or clinical mandates are being asked of people, only asked of people. And yes, possibly for a long time you couldn't go to some places without a mask, but you probably were not going to then be rounded up and carried off somewhere. What's the problem with that is not just the exploitation of the historical event. It's a kind of filtering of the term itself. And in a population of individuals, such as the American population, that lacks so much historical knowledge, my fear is that as we lose continually more and more of the survivors of the Holocaust, it's now becoming pure history. The actual people who were able to survive it are dying, they're older and dying. We're going to lose a real sense of what that was. And as we filter out the meaning of it, so that anytime somebody is asked to do anything that goes against their own sense of free will, or their own sense of absolute freedom, they begin to sort of take a language that, well, it feels like it's the Nazis, it feels like it's the Holocaust, it feels like I'm being exploited, this mask feels like a yellow star. As we start filtering out the truth of the Holocaust, we begin to enter into very treacherous territory. Without historical knowledge, then we begin to kind of cheapen that event. And since we already have Holocaust deniers, since we already have people who wonder if it was really so bad, we already have people today, without historical knowledge, kind of rewriting history the way we see it being rewritten by so many other figures in politics, then we begin to march towards what is unfortunately another dimension of what has to be understood to be anti-Semitism, right? Because when we begin to say that this was not so bad, or what I'm experiencing is just what happened to the Jewish people in Germany or Poland in 1943, and we begin to sort of victimize ourselves in the same way, we cheapen what happened in 1939 to 1945. We lie about it, and we also create in ourselves a sense of a kind of victimized arrogance that somehow we're experiencing the same kind of horror, which of course we're not. Nothing like it, nothing at all like it. But the use of the term and the exploitation of the term strikes me, again, as somebody who's not of the Jewish faith, but strikes me as just another example of a kind of rampant anti-Semitism that's rising up again in our country. And anytime we begin to see the kind of sort of separation of a certain group and sort of taking over the language, taking over the experience, taking over the culture of a group's real experience and making it our own and denying them their reality, then we begin to get into situations and ways of understanding the past and the present that are both corrupted and I think actually enters into the realm of not allowing people their full voice, and then makes certain kinds of actions and attitudes towards that group that has been sectioned off or that has been denied its reality more easily victimized. So I just think we need to think very carefully about the words we use. I teach literature, and to my way of thinking, nothing is more powerful than the word. That old line, sticks and stones will break your bones, but names will never hurt me. Quite the contrary. Names, words, language can do a kind of damage in some situations that sticks and stones could never do. So if we want to address the truth of history, if we want to own what has happened and understand the legacy of that and be honest about it and come to a realization of what benefits we have, and sure, you don't have to like what you're being asked to do if you don't want to wear a mask, or if you don't want to get vaccinated, you just don't want to do whatever you're being asked to do. But allow the truth of history to stand, because it's when we corrupt history, it's when we lie about history, especially for a population that is not historically informed, then we begin to live in sort of a world that has no foundation. As long as we find a way of saying that history doesn't matter, or I can make history what I want it to be, then we can cheapen the truth, which of course leads to more problems than I think we're able to handle. So I think from this point on, when someone is called upon, or when somebody does use a term, particularly like the Shoah, or they use the word Holocaust, or they talk about someone being a Nazi, or they talk about words that are ways of speaking that have nothing to do with reality and everything to do with a kind of self-arrogance in their victimization, we need to call people on that. Doesn't mean they can't be upset with what's going on, but they also can't exploit what is still in some ways the most horrific event in human history of what people were experienced by another, and they have to own up to that and allow that truth to stand and create their own truth.